All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the Good Tech Fest half day 2020. I know it's a weird circumstances, obviously. Not quite the hallway conference experience that we all always enjoy, but nevertheless, really appreciate you taking the time to come today and listen to this talk, which is about data governance and self-sovereignty. I'm going to share my screen real quick here. We have a small enough group that what I'd like to do today is I'll go through my slides, of which there are about 30, and then I'm hoping that we can actually have a pretty robust discussion, because I know this is a topic of interest in a lot of different sectors right now. There's a lot of new thinking going on, which is very exciting, and I would like those of you who are doing interesting work in this area to have the chance to share out what you're up to as well. But for now, let me see if I can get this into present mode. I can. All right, data governance and self-sovereignty. So my name is Tom Plagge. I'm the CTO of a company called BrightHive. We are based in Chicago, but we're actually remote first, even before COVID. So I'm in Berkeley, California. And our company focuses on mostly institutional data sharing, cross-organization data sharing, generally among companies, nonprofits, or government agencies who are custodians of other people's data. And so self-sovereignty is a thing that we have a lot of customers interested in, but not a lot of customers currently doing. Nevertheless, there's been so much activity both in the technology and the policy side over the past year that we've kind of jumped into a few different coalitions that are working on firming this idea up and starting to bring it out into production. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of those today. Trust Over IP Foundation, as well as the T3 Innovation Network's Comprehensive Learner Worker Records initiative, which I think are pretty on point, but also are exemplars of initiatives that are going on in a number of different sectors as well. So here's the big idea, right? Let's consider Anne, the recent college graduate. She's just recently gotten out of college. She's looking around for her first job. And if you were to pose a question to Anne, who owns your data? Well, if it was a question she'd ever even thought about, she would probably have a lot of different answers, right? There's a lot of people who own data about Anne. There's the registrar of the college from which she just graduated. There's the K-12 school district that she went through. Former employers, the DMV, credit bureaus, social media platforms, you name it. All these different agencies or organizations or companies own data that is pertinent to what Anne is currently thinking about, which is her first job. And it might be a reasonable question to ask, well, who owns my data? Why shouldn't I? Why do all these companies and organizations own my data and have the ultimate say over who's using it for what? Why don't I at least have a role to play in making that decision? For just to take a small specific example, why should I have to pay for a copy of my college transcript? I spent thousands of dollars on that college education. Like, shouldn't I just be able to print one out? Why do I need to pay for that privilege? That's crazy. So let's say I could just do that, print one out. It might look like this. If I'm vouching for my own awesomeness, I'm going to portray myself as pretty awesome, right? So therein lies the rub, right? There's data ownership, but ownership is a notion that really applies to physical things, and data is a different beast. What might we mean by data ownership? Well, we were implying earlier that it meant the right to move, transfer, copy, amend, destroy, redistribute, sell, but then there's also the power to verify, right? And rarely does anybody, even in the case that we were talking about before, the college registrar, have all of the above privileges that we think of as attached to ownership, when it comes to physical things. So let's unpack this a little bit. In the world of data and data sharing, you could imagine a few different roles being played in the sharing process. You have an issuer of information, let's say the college. You have a holder, the registrar or me. I might have a verified copy of it. And then you have the verifier, who in this case is an employer who wants to check to make sure that I've actually taken the classes that I said I have, that I completed the major that I put in my resume, etc. It's often the case that the holder and the subject are the same person. It is generally the case that the issuer is the person with the power to revoke or amend, whereas the holder has the power to store, transfer, or retrieve. And the verifier in this case only has the ability to receive and confirm. So again, this is the case where the issuer is the University of California, the holder and the subject are Anne, the verifier is the employer to which she is applied. You can imagine another scenario where the issuer is, let's say, Visa, who has information about the balance that I've been holding on my credit card. That information is passed to Experian, a credit bureau, so they're the holder of it. The subject of it is Anne, she's the one with the credit card. And the verifier in this case would be like a mortgage banker if Anne applied for a mortgage for her first house. Right, so there's a case where the holder and the subject are different, but those same sort of roles exist. But this is an interesting one, the credit bureau example, because in reality, this is what the credit bureau situation looks like. Right? The holder is Experian, Anne is the subject. Every issuer with whom she's ever had any sort of financial relationships, and probably some that she hasn't, because there's mistakes on a lot of these credit reports, are transferring all sorts of crap to Experian, who hold it and then send it out to all different kinds of verifiers, maybe even without the permission of Anne. Who even knows who's getting this information? It's a mess, right? The college transcript situation is one where the merits of having some sort of self-sovereignty are maybe a little ambiguous. When it comes to your credit report data, I think it's super clear, right? In an ideal world, there's definitely more rights and responsibilities vested in Anne than there are in the actually existing world where Experian and the other credit bureaus hold all the cards. So it's situations like that that have motivated folks to start thinking about this notion of self-sovereignty, where the subject of a claim has control over when, how, to whom, and for what purpose that claim is disclosed. And by claim here, I can mean a lot of things, but one particularly important thing is identity. And, you know, that's not the only thing, like transcripts and financial records and all this other stuff. Those are claims as well. But at the basis of almost all of them lies some sort of notion of identity. I am who I say I am. I have a driver's license in my wallet. What's the digital equivalent of that? So is self-sovereignty the same thing as data ownership? Well, basically. In a self-sovereign situation, as constructed by most of the folks who are thinking about this topic, I, as the subject and holder of my credentials and claims, have the right to retrieve, move, and transfer it, the right to amend or destroy it. The ability to redistribute it implied that the ability to sell it, right? If somebody's going to monetize the data, then I should get a cut. It's my data, at least in principle. But I don't have the power to verify, right? If I'm an employer and I have asked for the complete verified transcript of Anne passes along some information that's incomplete or amended or modified in some way, then if I'm the employer and I request verification from the issuer, they'll say, nope, that's not it. And try again, Anne. So it's a notion that's very close to the notion of actually owning one's own data, but with the institutions and the bonds of trust that reflect the way it works in reality. The way it works offline, if you will. Oftentimes, discussions of self-sovereignty and self-sovereign identity end up circling around to a specific technology, which is blockchain. But self-sovereignty and blockchain are different. For example, HIPAA in principle, gives you self-sovereignty over your medical records, gives you the right to do all the things that I mentioned earlier, even though those medical records are centrally housed by your medical providers. They're not on the blockchain. And relatedly, the self-sovereignty notion does not solve the problem of the disappearing verifier. This is something that is maybe not top of mind, but definitely like a lingering concern during COVID times as institutions of higher education, many of them are struggling financially. What if a university or a college disappears? Who's going to verify the credentials of the people who graduated from them? Who's going to issue the transcripts? That's a problem, and self-sovereignty doesn't solve it on its own. But the notion of verifiable credentials is one that I think is now pretty well thought through. It just isn't necessarily widely used on the internet. But the idea is that there's an issuer of decentralized identifiers, DIDs, usually implemented using some sort of blockchain. And there's an issuer who signs credentials. There's a holder who keeps those signed credentials in their wallet. There's a verifier who requests proof and receives that verifiable credential and verifies it if they want to, oftentimes using the blockchain. So even though self-sovereignty doesn't imply blockchain, this is usually the implementation and the rules that people are talking about when they bring this topic up. Self-sovereignty requires data standards and interoperability to be meaningful and useful. That includes standards for identity providers, and includes mechanisms for identity verification and exchange. It includes standards for credential issuance, exchange, and verification. And in some cases, it can include stuff about hardware, And just importantly, it not only requires data standards, it requires trust and governance. Some of those trust relationships, like between employers and registrars, those have to exist and they have to be formalized in some way for this whole idea to work at scale. So this is where an initiative called the Trust Over IP Foundation picks things up. This is hosted by the Linux Foundation. It's a really interesting group of folks. A lot of them come from the world of distributed identity, but not all of them. And their idea is to try to create and see deployed at scale some notion of trust on the internet that combines cryptographic trust as implemented, often by the blockchain, with some notion of actual trust and governance, trust in the colloquial sense. And the way that they're approaching this problem is in two parallel stacks. There's the technology stack on the right and the governance stack on the left. Each stack has 4 layers. At the bottom is utilities, in particular digital identity, distributed identity. Next up is the wallets, and then the actual credentials that are being exchanged. And then at the top, an ecosystem. Now, an ecosystem in this sense is maybe different from the colloquial ecosystem, but not so different. In the world of higher education, you might think of an ecosystem as a network of accredited institutions. Right? The ecosystem governance framework would be the accrediting body. Those bodies describe what it is that you mean by a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree, and they certify that such and such institution, the University of California, is implementing that and is teaching what they say they are, and that the words that they're using mean what is widely recognized to mean. Right? So it's a governance structure, and at the ecosystem level. So the Trust Over IP Foundation is out to set up a set of standards, not one standard to rule them all, but a sort of set of templates and rules for different ecosystems to implement trusted communications over the internet, verifiable credentials, for example. And the flow that they're envisioning is much like the one that we talked about before, with the addition here on the bottom of the governance authority and governance framework, which were, I think, implied in a way in the previous diagram, but here it's totally explicit. Right? There's the expectation that anybody who is doing a trust over IP compliant ecosystem would have a formal governance framework, formal governance authority, who would in turn, in addition to the cryptographic trust, which might be brought on by the technology that's being used, bring some more colloquial trust into the equation. So what might that look like? Well, a governance framework in the trust over IP setting generally looks like this. There is usually a web presence associated with the governance body where the governance framework is published. There's a master document along with legal agreements, glossary, controlled documents. And a lot of this thinking comes from digital identity providers like Sovereign, as well as sort of canonical examples of trusted data sharing ecosystems like the international credit card system. These are the classes of documents that are generally involved in that governance framework, which is a very famous one. And likewise, it's the class of documents that you can find on Sovereign's webpage if you were to go there and start digging into digital identity, distributed identity. This is a different perspective on what data governance means than I think is typical in the social sector. For those of us who work with governments, local governments, state governments, or with nonprofits and foundations, we often find ourselves in the situation of thinking about data stewards, right? Somebody who manages a giant database with one row per person or per family or something like that, and oftentimes with sensitive information in it, how much income somebody has, cases in the family services, family protective services. That's very important, personally identifiable, protected data. The data stewards oftentimes have some governance attached with that, some responsibilities, fiduciary or otherwise, that they have to the people whose data they're stewarding, and legal controlling documents that govern how a particular data steward might share, de-identify, or aggregate that data for use by others. It's just a different way of thinking about data governance when you start getting into self-sovereignty. And it's pretty easy to understand why, right? If I have data that's being held by the state unemployment insurance system, or if I have data that's being held by the state's Department of Family Services, I don't have meaningful self-sovereignty over that data, right? It's data about me, and it's not data that I control in any meaningful way. It's controlled by bodies larger than myself. And it's questionable whether any of those cases are ones where you would want a notion of self-sovereignty. So it's important to say that this is one view of data governance that's kind of particular to the type of ecosystem that trust over IP is hoping to enable and build some standards around. And it's very suitable in the case where you want, as a matter of policy, data subjects to have a direct say in decisions. Oftentimes, there's a desire in state and local government to involve the subjects in some way, shape, or form, usually through like some sort of representative, whether it's an institutional representative or just a person from a selected population. For example, I was part of a project once where we're talking with folks in homeless services who had a regional data collaborative, if you will, and a governance board associated with it, and they actually included a homeless individual on that governance board, with the notion of, hey, this data actually affects this person and their peers, like they should have a say in who it's being shared with, what it's being used for, which is a great idea. And one that I think a lot of nonprofits as well are starting to play around with. Like, how do we empower the folks who we're trying to help in a more meaningful way and helping to make decisions about what's effective, what's meaningful. But that's different from self-sovereignty. It's addressing a similar concern, but in a different way. I guess you could think of it in a way as analogous with informed consent. Self-sovereignty is, I guess you could say, a strong and enforceable form of informed consent. In privacy law, things are moving, I would say, away from uh, informed consent as the appropriate model and toward a model of fiduciary duty, which maps very nicely to this sort of old-fashioned notion, if you will, of data stewards and institutional data ownership. But if you were to do informed consent well, in my opinion, uh, that basically implies self-sovereignty. Now, the tricky thing is, I think, where you draw the line. Where do you draw the line between, I think, a reasonable expectation that, in my example, Anne had, that I should have more agency over who's using my data for what. I should get a cut of it if somebody's selling my data. With, on the other hand, some pretty legitimate countervailing concerns. COVID has brought this to the forefront, in particular with contact tracing. Public health is like an important public concern, and should individuals be able to opt out of it and just choose not to share their COVID status? People say yes, people say no, but it's certainly not completely obvious, I don't think. Law enforcement is another one that's obviously in the news right now. Researching government statistics, the census, like this is all ripped from the headline stuff here. And it really is, I think, not a case where you can point to self-sovereignty and say, look, we're empowering individuals maximally. This is the right thing to do, and everything that's not self-sovereign is incomplete or wrong or needs to be rethought in these terms. It's appropriate for some kinds of data and not for others, and there's real debates to be had over what's appropriate for what scenario. Some trade-offs to consider. Well, if you are going self-sovereign, you should go self-sovereign. Basically, every administrative data that system that feeds into a self-sovereign ecosystem has the potential to at least partially undermine it. If you build in a backdoor, right? If you're keeping a separate administrative data system for your own use internally, maybe even sharing it with some researchers or something as like a backdoor, which is often the case. Like public health is a great example of this, right? Like maybe you're contributing data to some sort of contact tracing effort, but if you're a hospital and you're also keeping track of all this information, reporting it to the public health department, and the public health department has like a massive database of everybody who's ever been COVID positive, that it sort of undermines the rationale for employing a self-sovereign governance structure to that ecosystem. Every accountability mechanism for data stewards is less empowering to individuals than self-sovereignty, so that's a trade-off to consider. The status quo is extremely poor, so maybe if self-sovereignty is still not the optimal solution, like it might be better than where we are now. And as I mentioned earlier, privacy is not and never has been the only consideration. My go-to example for this is like, remember when we were kids and people had phone books? there's all sorts of scenarios where you might sacrifice privacy in favor of convenience, desire to just be contactable, searchable, discoverable, or to achieve some public good. So here's an example that I think is a really interesting and powerful one of where self-sovereignty does seem appropriate and seems like it could have a really substantive improvement on a very significant section of all of our lives, and that is with learning and employment records. The T3 Innovation Network is a group of technologists and practitioners in the talent marketplace, education, workforce, etc. It was brought together under the auspices of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And one of the tasks that it's taken on is trying to come up with an analog for electronic medical records for the talent marketplace. Something where I, as an individual who has educational background, jobs that I've had in the past, classes that I've taken online, can have some sort of complete verifiable record of what I know, how I've come to know it, the credentials that I have, the experience that I have, that I can carry with me in a digital wallet that's open and interoperable, that captures learning wherever it occurs, that contains verifiable claims in the sense that we talked about earlier. And a key to this is also including really granular data on skills and competencies so that it sort of exists outside of a particular ecosystem context and embedded within a larger one, simply because traditionally higher education and workforce and even different fields within higher education and different occupations within private employers use different words to mean different things. So having some sort of consistent way of capturing what's being learned, what's being used in a job is part of what makes this interoperable and useful in practice. Now, what goes on to a learning and employment record? Degrees, work experience, coursework, workforce training, on-the-job training, side projects, and military experience on this list is definitely worth calling out because this is something that the US military is extremely interested in. If you think about one of the ways in which sort of traditional processes of in the talent marketplace break down, a great example and one that we see all the time is when a military service person leaves the services and attempts to get back into the private employer marketplace with, in many cases, like really deep and useful marketable skills, but skills that they acquired in some way other than going to a traditional four-year university, and so it's not valued by or understood by a lot of employers to whom they may be applying. All right, so this is definitely an area that the military and Veterans Affairs Department is extremely interested in. There's been a lot of momentum and a lot of effort in this space in the past, trying to create some sort of a learning and employment record. Registrars' offices are one place that have tried to engage in this problem. There's other like learning economy. I'm not going to be able to name check everybody who's working in this space, but suffice it to say that there's a lot of efforts like this. And that's because there's a lot of potential use cases. As a worker, I might be, let's say, displaced from my job because I was working in the hospitality industry and COVID hit. Now I want to take the skills that I've gained over the course of my employment in the hospitality industry and apply them to an unfamiliar context. As an employer, I might be trying to improve my diversity and inclusion by reaching out to audiences who might have non-traditional degrees or may be parts of underrepresented or disadvantaged groups. As a learner, I might be trying to figure out how to take my, let's say, 2 years of college that didn't result in a degree and take advantage of that and build upon it and create a learning pathway for myself that gets me to the career goals that I have. And then I already mentioned veteran reintegration. As a service member entering the civilian workforce, how might I leverage what I learned? These are all cases that kind of cry out for some sort of a distributed identity, verifiable claims approach. And the T3 group is hoping to take an approach that's consistent with that that the Trust over IP Foundation and others have mapped out as what they see as an emerging standard. In this case, the ecosystem level would be auditors, accreditors, framework owners, et cetera. Credential level would be universities, employers, the military. And then the utility and provider level would be wallets, key management, et cetera. So it really is a similar structure. There's a whole set of actors out there who I think are well represented here at Good Tech Fest, who are, let's say, researchers or funders who are very interested in talent marketplace data. And I would say that for those folks, the notion of a self-sovereign learning and employment record is one that is both promising and a little scary, or at least it should be, because there are massive opportunities. It's a way to create structured longitudinal data to get informed consent in a very structured way to actually use it in studies. It's much richer data, at least as envisioned by T3, where we have all these deep categorizations of skills and competencies embedded in different credentials and work experiences. Um, there's a bit of an impedance mismatch as well. The way that researchers have traditionally done their job is they've negotiated data sharing agreements with a couple institutions. They haven't gone out in mass to hundreds of thousands of individuals and tried to get their consent to do a study. So it's something to keep an eye on if you are in that position. And there's challenges to it as well. Distributed identities are still getting to scale. There's a lack of standards and interoperabilities around skills and competencies in particular. Every field, every domain has their own way of describing skills and competencies. Even the word competencies is fraught. If you talk to somebody who has worked in the space before, depending on where they're coming from, they might understand that word to mean something completely different. Getting buy-in from faculties and registrars at traditional higher ed institutions can be a challenge, can be perceived as a threat. Employers are very comfortable with the notion of just looking at whether somebody has a four-year college degree or not as a proxy for a whole bunch of stuff. And convincing them to do something more complicated than that is also non-trivial. So yeah, there's a lot of different roadblocks, but the use cases are compelling enough that all of these different organizations are trying to move forward with it. There's a lot of support from the White House, believe it or not, and something seems likely to happen. How widely adopted it becomes, I think, is dependent on whether any of those challenges are able to be overcome, and frankly, whether the distributed identity verifiable credentials model ends up being widely adopted. Certainly, there's a lot of folks out there proselytizing on its behalf, and a lot of compelling use cases for it, but we just haven't seen it really take off in the consumer-facing world yet. If it does, it's very exciting, and it could change the game. So I would love to hear from the folks on this call, especially because it's a nice sized group with an interesting group of backgrounds, but it's not so big as to be overwhelming. I would love to hear from some of you how the notion of self-sovereign identities or self-sovereign data governance is playing out in the domain where you have experience and expertise. And if you have anything to share, please go ahead and raise your hand, and I will. I can actually kind of take everybody off mute, I believe. But yeah, anybody want to go first? Yeah.
Yeah means.
Go ahead. It's all you.
Yeah, Steve. Okay. Lots of cool ideas and concepts. My own work, my organization's work, is around community organization and community data sovereignty, if you will, to kind of use these terms. But at its root, to get community members to participate, there has to be some concept of self-sovereignty and understanding how my data is going to be used by my community. But we're grappling with these issues at a community level, like, so a community has social data and agriculture output data and even weather data and things like that that are valuable to it as a communal public good almost, but also valuable to outside partners or outside participants. So, the UN spends billions of dollars trying to gather this data. And so if a community already has it, maybe the community could sell it and the UN would pay less and the community would get income versus sort of come in and being subject to some statistical data gathering. So lots of interesting things that caught my mind in particular is kind of a chain of trust when you're in a local government situation where there's not a strong identity record of any sort, and a lot of identity is starting to be device-based. And so how do you build a chain of trust from a phone number, basically, or access to a particular phone? So it's kind of building up chains of trust where your other members of your community vouch that you're a community member, and then you have access to community resources and can participate. So kind of, yeah, so that I think that's interesting. And then we also are struggling with the concept of non-governmental trusted intermediaries, these data stewards that can hold data under a data governance agreement and talk about how they're going to aggregate it and how they're going to keep it safe. Participants might not trust their government to do that. There might not be a bank that they trust, or that might be an obvious candidate for this trusted intermediary. But there's a need for those sorts of things to occur.
And when you say community, are you generally, like, in the first part of what you were mentioning, were you generally talking about local governments, or do you mean community organizations?
Mostly what we're trying to work with is what we would describe as a multi-stakeholder partnership, a mixture of community organizations, local businesses, local government, that have come together to, in our case, try to solve sustainable development problems. And so they're gathering data in support of that sustainable development activity.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a really interesting use case. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's one that I actually worked on a little bit through the lens of building energy efficiency, which has some nice bright line rules around what it is you can do with aggregates and individual level data. But it's, I would say, like, very difficult to engage people who have the power to, let's say, share their data to make it useful for a public good type analysis, because most people are just not interested. They're not listening to the utility company. If it were to spam out some sort of, hey, could you share your 15-minute usage data with us to do this energy efficiency pilot? Like, most people don't know what that means. So how do you deal with that in the realm of community development, which I think is kind of similar, where you have the problem of the 50 people who show up at every community meeting,
Yeah.
but the vast majority of people kind of unaware or not engaged?
So if we use the example of a rural farm-oriented or farming and pastoralist herding animals type society, what we're trying to do is provide digital tools that provide utility to the individual by entering data, right? So if I enter this data about my farm, I get back insights that will help me make more money, basically, right? And if I can deliver value immediately for that data input, now I have data which I can ask to share in exchange for additional value, right? So if I take your data and compare it to your neighbors, now I can tell you how you're doing versus other people, and maybe even tell you anonymously about other things that other people are doing that might make your outputs even better. So that is that value exchange and creating appropriate incentives that start with individuals providing data.
And that's really interesting. Also, just one other thing that I wanted to point out is, I'm not sure whether you're aware of it or not, but the work that's being done in British Columbia right now by the provincial government there around establishing some sort of digital identity system for all citizens. I would say it's much more mature there than just about anywhere else in the world, except for maybe Estonia, and worth talking to, or at least Googling that effort if it's something you're interested in. I see a couple of other folks on video. Anybody else want to share some thoughts about self-sovereign identity in their field of choice?
Andrew, Mike Smiles here with Volunteer Match. You probably know we're trying to establish a coalition for volunteer impact where volunteers have more information more effectively to engage them, personalized data, if you will. Hey, there's some people picking up trash down the street. Would you like to join them? Not sure if you know of any activity as we enter that concept hosted by Giving Tuesday and creating sort of what philanthropy is now establishing to do the same with volunteer activity. We are going to be partnering with doit.life in the UK, and we're going to be looking for other nonprofit and international nonprofit organizations and entities. Advice on that as it relates to each volunteer having their data. Hey, I gave the Red Cross as my data, and I have the data for my college where I volunteered, and so on.
Well, sounds to me like this, like Well, actually, let me ask this because I'm not entirely sure. Is the data that you're interested in sort of the like a digital badge type thing where somebody who's actually gone out and done the work would have some evidence that they did the work, and then that would in turn allow other nonprofits to be able to reach out to them and suggest similar related opportunities, but also for them to present it as evidence to employers or schools or whatever of tangible achievements. Is that the sort
Yeah,
of data you want?
that's the type of thing of, Strava for Good as an example of sharing the fact that you help pick up trash on on the riverfront with a team of people, and you got some exercise out of it, and having that flow more freely.
Yeah, yeah, I would say that I'm aware of a few different organizations who have been trying to do uh, who've been trying to use digital badges for this purpose. And I think the main hurdle that they've run into is that there's a lot of folks interested in issuing digital badges and fewer folks interested in consuming digital badges. So the value of the credential is not perceived to be super high. And also, I don't know that there's a great consumer-facing application out there. I know that there's a lot of really interesting ones, but not ones where they maybe is a robust enough ecosystem and like a large enough user base to say, okay, well, these folks have critical mass, and people really are interested in engaging and accruing credit on this platform, which they can share with others. So I would say I've seen a lot of interest in it, particularly the Chicago and other cities have tried to do this with after school programs and stuff like that, as well as volunteering efforts. And the gap seems to be like employers or schools or anybody else really wanting to engage in consuming that data and using it for something.
Thank you. The monetization is not exactly there, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's worth noting that LinkedIn has already taken the time to put a section in your LinkedIn profile of volunteer activities. And it's conceivable that they would be interested as a partner in sort of taking that to the next level.
It absolutely is. And they are very interested because I think they're aware that their first attempt at, I don't know if it's their first attempt, but their most public attempt at this of like letting you say, hey, I know Steve, he's great at, calculus. That did not turn out to be super valuable. So they're interested in and engaged in trying to come up with ways of reformulating that notion of non-traditional credentials, of giving people credit for things that they've learned or demonstrate facility with outside of a traditional academic environment.
We're in strong contact with LinkedIn for Good, so we'll continue the conversation, but thank you, Steve, for that, and Andrew. Thank you both.
So not to call out Brian and Ellie Gemma, but the BrightHive affiliated folks on the call, I know we've been thinking a lot about data privacy law and ways in which, say, the GDPR, the CCPA, or whatever might affect our business going forward as BrightHive, and in particular about the right to be forgotten and the right to opt out of data collection, and for government administrative data systems where opting out is not so trivial, how that might look in reality. I hesitate to really get into it because I don't want to talk specifically about any things that our customers have shared with us in confidence, but I will say that broadly speaking, there's confusion about how the right to be forgotten gets implemented in practice and how you even check whether somebody has been forgotten. And I think the self-sovereign piece that we talked about here earlier is like an elegant solution for that. It certainly, I think, meets the requirements of the law. But it's also got its drawbacks, I think, as well. either BrightHive folks or others, do you want to talk at all about how CCPA and GDPR are playing out with government administrative data systems in particular? If not, I can.
Well, just to put a non-BrightHive spin, besides my role in this nonprofit, I have another role with a med tech startup that is collecting sort of health data, and so grappling with some of these new laws while maintaining anonymized health records that can be used for research purposes has been kind of an interesting challenge, right? So how much data about, so in particular, we gather exercise session data. So we know the timestamp of every heartbeat and every step that you took in a run, that kind of thing. We don't know where you ran, right? So we don't have the Strava problem of people can figure out where you live by that sort of thing. But we do have this very detailed data about how your heart was beating over the course of this exercise session. And our thinking is if we take off all the sort of user identifier from that record and then further obfuscate the date, so blur it, right? So add a random positive or negative timestamp to the existing date timestamp, that we end up with a usable research tool that is valuable even after a user has been forgotten. So yeah. just kind of one specific example.
Yeah, and so, I really like those kinds of bright line rules. As somebody who's been in the role of a researcher, like if there were more data privacy rules that were just super concrete about it, like in California, they set the rule for energy that you can aggregate, you can publish aggregated energy usage data so long as, I believe the number was, there's 20 or more individuals and no individual account makes up more than 10 or 20% of the usage. And I don't know exactly what the specific formula is, but the important thing is that there was a formula. And you could just know whether you were complying with the law and had a research tool that was valid to be used, and you didn't have to worry about getting sued over it. Yeah, that was tremendously valuable, even if I would have liked to have those thresholds dialed down a little bit.
Yeah, these safe harbors allow people to act, right?
Exactly. Well, I really appreciate those of you who've jumped in here and wanted to talk this through. Steve, thank you in particular. If there are no other folks who want to share, I'm happy to end the session a little bit early and let you go on with your day. It is 7 minutes till noon Pacific, so I'm going to have some lunch. But
I actually have another question, but not if anybody else has a question.
Yeah.
So not exactly connected to our other work, but more personally, this concept of an anonymous repeatable identity has been interesting, right? So you don't know who I am, so it's not attached to a person or a phone or a device or an address or whatever, but I can demonstrate that I am the same person who did these previous activities. Mm-hmm. Do you see any work, research? I mean, is that a commercially valuable thing, that concept?
It is. There's a lot of different spins on it out there, though, that kind of come down to the notion of how much of this should be public, right? How much do we want? Because I think the default position in the blockchain world is kind of like, well, the chain is public. You can go out and audit it. People are who they say they are. And then if you want to actually like request data on it, that's private. But your identity is kind of public, versus the notion that you're talking about, where it's much more like, all I'm doing is like checking and verifying that I'm the same person as you asked about, or the same person who had this particular credential. There's blockchain implementations that work that way as well. But I think that the thing that is not demonstrated successfully yet to my satisfaction is that this can be done at scale uh, uh, in a way that consumers will buy into, right? Like there's just, blockchain for so long has felt like a solution in search of a problem. And the actual implementations have just been clunkier than they were advertised, and things just haven't scaled as cleanly as they were supposed to. And I have this like innate skepticism about it as a solution. But it does solve that particular problem in a way that no other technology that I'm aware of does cleanly without introducing some global centralized warehouse, which requires almost absolute trust. So it's the only game in town that I'm aware of. It
Well,
just
and
hasn't been demonstrated yet to my satisfaction.
biometric data is interesting, right? You could imagine that I could approach TSA and have my elbow scanned, elbow prints, new biometric technology, and that will prove that I don't have a history of doing bad things, or I have a history of flying safely, or whatever TSA needs to prove. It's not clear to me what TSA is proving now by checking our ID, but TSA doesn't need to know who I am. They sort of just need to know who I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
And then that could be separate from actually getting on the plane, where the airline might have a legitimate interest to know that I am the person who made the reservation. Not that they ever used to care until TSA made it easy for them. But it just seems like, I guess ultimately I'm just saying, so biometrics are sort of intrinsically repeatable anonymous identity until you attach that biometric to a person.
Mm-hmm. Or until you start attaching enough data points to that biometric.
Where anything becomes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I absolutely agree. It is the ultimate way out of the whole like password problem. So hopefully, I mean, I don't know about you, but in my desk right here, I have a list of passwords written out by hand. Like it's embarrassing. I work for a technology company, but I still write down my passwords.
Yes,
Anyway,
I tell myself I should use one of those tools that my friends tell me I should use, but
yeah, no, that's right. I actually do use 1Password as well. 1Password is quite good. Well, anyway, thank you all so very much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it and found it edifying. And thanks again for attending Good Tech Fest.
Tom, I did have one kind of broader question if we still have some time.
Yeah, go ahead. We have 4 minutes until I think somebody else is going to take over this line.
So thinking about the fiduciary duty that you mentioned, kind of in comparison to something like self-sovereignty or informed consent, do you think there's a risk if we move to kind of broad self-sovereignty measures across a bunch of different spaces of putting a lot of burden on individuals who might not have the time or mental bandwidth or resources to kind of actually make informed decisions about how their data is used?
I do, right? And so it's a question, I think, of where you put the accountability. Well, there's a couple questions. Number one, how do you design a user interface and a user experience around giving consent that is meaningful and good? And I think Apple and Google have both like done okay at that. Like the state of the art now is certainly better than it was, and we were all just clicking through giant shrink wrap agreements. But it's still not great. And then there's also the question of where the ultimate, like, what is the accountability mechanism? If you are kind of just like asking users to give blanket permission and then that blanket permission is abused in some way, what's your recourse? What recourse do I have? Under the fiduciary duty model, I think a lot of the accountability mechanism relies on the plaintiff's bar, which the plaintiff's bar is very active in the United States, and so that might work just fine, or regulators, and I think that is, in my mind, a cleaner and more plausible accountability mechanism. So I would say, despite my enthusiasm about self-sovereignty in certain domains, if you were to ask me which approach I prefer for data privacy law, I think it would actually be fiduciary duty. I still think that the bulk of data is better managed, better thought of as being managed by a data steward who has responsibility to the individuals whose data they're stewarding, than as it is an asset being owned by an individual who has control over what it's being used for, because I don't think it's a burden that most people want or need for most of the data that they're generating. That's just my take.
No, thanks. That lines up with kind of the way I was thinking about some of this. And there's nothing to say that these two things are mutually exclusive, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I think my financial data or my my education and learning record are two things that I actually am sort of engaged in and want to make sure they're accurate and have vested interest in making sure they're accurate and that I know who's using them and for what. My energy records, I don't care really. You know, there's just a lot of data that I generate that I'm happy if people use them to make systems run more efficiently or improve public health or whatever, and I just don't care. And it would be nice, I think, if there were some differentiation between what are really high value data assets and what were personally identifiable. And yes, you could construct some absurd scenario where compromise would have serious consequences, but like basically it's fine. So yeah, understanding the risk model I think is important. But thank you again. It is now time for me to hop off, but appreciate everybody being here and hope to hear from you soon.